The lake had always been quiet. Not the kind of quiet that felt empty, but the kind that made people slow down without thinking about it. Early mornings were filled with soft ripples on the water, birds skimming the surface, and the low hum of wind moving through tall trees. The man who lived near the eastern edge of the lake had grown used to that rhythm. For years he woke up with the sun, made a simple cup of tea, and walked down the narrow path from his house to the water. His boat was already there, tied to the same wooden post it had been tied to for as long as he could remember. It was not a fancy boat. The paint was faded in places, the wood worn smooth by time and weather, but it floated well, and it had never failed him. He used it for quiet rides, for fishing, and sometimes just to sit and think while the lake carried him slowly forward. People around the lake knew him as someone who kept to himself. He was polite, but not loud. Friendly, but not curious about other people's business. He fixed things with his hands, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble. In return, no one caused trouble for him either. That was how it had been for many years. Things began to change one summer. New houses started appearing along the western side of the lake. Big houses. Clean lines, wide glass windows, and long decks that reached toward the water like open arms. Trucks came and went for weeks, carrying wood, stone, and furniture. The sound of hammers and drills echoed across the lake, breaking the peaceful mornings. The man watched all of this from a distance. He did not complain. Change was part of life. People moved in, people moved out. The lake stayed. When the houses were finished, new neighbors arrived. They were different from the old residents. They liked things neat and controlled. They talked loudly on their decks and walked around as if the land already knew their names. They often gathered together, pointing at things, discussing what should be done and how things should look. At first, they barely noticed the man or his boat. That changed one afternoon when the man returned from the lake and saw 3 people standing near his boat. They were well dressed, wearing sunglasses and expensive shoes that looked out of place on the uneven ground. One of them was pointing at the boat, shaking his head. The man walked closer, calm as always. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady. One of the neighbors turned around and looked at him up and down. "Yes," the neighbor said. "That boat shouldn't be here." The man blinked once. "It's been here for years." "That doesn't matter," the neighbor replied. "It's blocking the view from our properties." The man looked past them, across the wide lake, then back at the houses. The view was still there. Water, sky, trees. Nothing had changed. "I don't see how," he said quietly. Another neighbor crossed their arms. "We've checked the community guidelines. Boats aren't supposed to be kept along this part of the shore." The man felt a small tightening in his chest, not fear, but surprise. "There were no guidelines before," he said. "Well, there are now," the first neighbor said. "We expect you to move it." The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once. "I'll think about it." The neighbors exchanged looks, clearly unhappy with the answer. They left without another word. That evening, the man sat on his porch and watched the sun sink into the lake. He had lived long enough to know that people often confused confidence with authority. He also knew when to speak and when to stay silent. For now, silence felt right. Over the next few days, the pressure grew. A note appeared on his door, written in sharp, rushed handwriting, repeating the demand to move the boat. Another note followed, warning of complaints and fines. The man read them carefully, folded them neatly, and placed them in a drawer. Other residents began to notice the tension. Some stopped to chat, asking careful questions. He answered simply, never blaming anyone, never defending himself too much. "We're talking," he would say. That's all. One morning, as he walked toward the lake, he found someone had untied his boat and pushed it slightly away from the shore. It had not drifted far, but the message was clear. He stood there for a long moment, watching the boat rock gently on the water. He felt anger rise, slow and heavy, but he did not let it take control. Instead, he waded in, pulled the boat back, and tied it securely. His hands moved with purpose, each knot tight and sure. From across the lake could feel eyes on him. Later that day, one of the neighbors approached him again, this time with a forced smile. "We're trying to keep things orderly around here," the neighbor said. "You understand?" "I understand respect," the man replied. The neighbor's smile faded. "You don't own this lake." The man looked at him for a long second, then nodded. "That's what you think." The words hung in the air, simple but firm. The neighbor frowned, unsure how to respond. As the days passed, the neighbors grew louder and bolder. They spoke about rules that no one remembered approving. They talked about bringing in officials, about making things official. The lake, once calm, felt tense, as if it were listening. The man continued his routine. Morning walks, quiet boat rides, evenings on the porch. Inside, though, he was preparing. Old memories surfaced, stories told by his elders, papers he had not looked at in years. He knew the truth of the lake, and he knew it well, but he also knew that truth had power only when the time was right. One afternoon, a small group gathered near the shore, pointing again at the boat. Voices rose. Accusations were made. Someone mentioned calling authorities. The man stood among them, calm as the water behind him. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply listened. When they finished, he said, "Do what you think you need to do." That answer confused them more than anger ever could. As they walked away, the lake returned to its quiet state. Birds skimmed the surface. The wind moved through the trees. The boat stayed where it was and beneath the calm. The first cracks had already begun to form in the neighbors' certainty, though they did not yet know it. The days after the first confrontation were tense. The new neighbors did not stop. They walked along the shore more often, as if inspecting the water for any sign of disobedience. They whispered among themselves, casting occasional glances toward the man and his boat. Their tone had changed from casual confidence to irritation. The irritation quickly turned into a kind of insistence that something had to be done. At first, the man ignored them. He moved with his usual calm routine, getting up with the sun, tending to his boat, checking the water for changes in the weather, and fishing in silence. The lake reflected everything perfectly: the sky, the trees, the light, but the reflections could not hide what was happening behind the surface. The neighbors began leaving notes. First, simple ones. "Please remove your boat," they wrote. Then, harsher ones. "You are in violation of lake regulations. Remove your boat immediately or face consequences." He read them quietly, folded them, and put them aside. He did not respond. His neighbors took silence as weakness. They did not realize that the man's patience was not weakness. It was awareness. One morning, a woman approached him while he was fixing a small leak in the boat. She was well-dressed, carrying a folder stuffed with papers. She held it out toward him. "These are the community rules," she said. "We've confirmed that the boat is not allowed here. You need to move it now." The man accepted the papers and leafed through them carefully. The language was formal, filled with legal-sounding words and phrases about common area regulations and property rights. But as he read, his brow furrowed. The documents were incomplete. Some pages referenced rules that had never been formally approved. Others cited areas that did not include the part of the lake where his boat had always been. He looked up at the woman, calm but firm. "I will review these." "Thank you," he said. She frowned. "There's no time to review. This is urgent. I'll handle it appropriately," he replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He did not need to. The certainty in his calmness was enough to make her hesitate. By the end of that week, things escalated further. A man appeared with a camera, taking photos of the boat and its position along the shore. He left without a word, but it was clear that the neighbors were documenting everything to prove their case. Other residents watched quietly, curious, but hesitant to get involved. Some of them remembered seeing the man on the lake for years, always polite, always responsible. But the new neighbor's confidence was intimidating. One evening, after the neighbors had left, the man walked along the shoreline. He ran his hands along the edge of the water, checking the boat's mooring, making sure everything was secure. He had lived with this boat for years. It was more than a possession, it was a part of his life, a companion in quiet hours and lonely mornings. He could not simply give it up because someone else demanded it. The tension in the air grew heavier each day. Notes turned into phone calls. One neighbor showed up at his door, knocking loudly in the early morning. When he opened it, they started lecturing him about community responsibility and rules. Rules exist for everyone, they said. You cannot just ignore them. I am aware of rules, he replied evenly. I follow them where they apply. I stared at him, unable to respond. There was no anger in his voice, only calm. And that calm was more unsettling than shouting or threats. It was not long before the neighbors began threatening legal action. If you don't move your boat, we will contact the authorities, one said. Another claimed fines would follow. The man had already anticipated this. Years ago, his family had acquired clear documentation proving ownership and access to the lake. He had never needed to use it, but he knew it existed. He kept the papers in a safe place, waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued, unaware that their confidence rested on a false assumption. They thought the lake was theirs to regulate. They did not know they were confronting the actual owner. During this period, some residents began asking questions. They were curious, but careful. Why are they so aggressive? One asked another. The man has been here longer than anyone. He's always been respectful, another replied. Maybe they don't know who he really is. The man, however, stayed mostly to himself. He spoke only when necessary, never explaining more than required. He knew the moment for full disclosure had not yet arrived. One afternoon, the neighbors decided to hold a meeting. They invited other residents. Speaking about shared responsibilities and keeping the lake orderly, they showed pictures of the boat, presented notes, and repeated warnings. The man attended quietly, listening. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He observed. He noticed the tension between the neighbors as they tried to convince others to take sides. Some residents nodded politely, but said nothing. Others whispered privately to one another, questioning the new neighbor's authority. When the meeting ended, one neighbor approached him directly. We will not stop until that boat is moved, they said. You cannot stay here. The man looked at them steadily. I am allowed to be here. The boat is allowed to be here. You're wrong, they replied. The man smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly. Time will tell. After that, he spent more hours on the boat, fishing and observing. He knew patience was his ally. The neighbors were loud and aggressive, but their knowledge was incomplete. They assumed authority they did not have. They assumed power they did not possess. Weeks passed, and the tension only increased. Threats continued, and the neighbors even spoke to local officials, claiming violations of community regulations. The man answered politely when contacted. He sent copies of documents showing historical usage and prior approvals. He did not shout. He did not escalate the situation. He let the facts speak quietly on their own. Some neighbors started to feel uneasy. They realized they might have underestimated the man. Others refused to admit it. They continued pushing, hoping that persistence alone would force him to move. The lake itself seemed to sense the tension. Early mornings were still calm, but there was a subtle change in the air. Even the birds seemed cautious. The man noticed it, but was unfazed. He knew the lake had weathered storms far greater than petty arguments one evening. As the sun set, the man sat on the dock and watched the water glow with the colors of the sky. He thought about how often people judge without knowing the full story. How often they assume power and authority without understanding the truth. He smiled faintly, knowing that the moment when the truth would emerge was approaching. The neighbors, meanwhile, continued their small campaign, unaware that each note, each complaint, each photograph was only deepening their own problems. They believed they were in control, but the man had already set everything in motion. The documents, the history, the ownership will reveal the reality. And while the tension grew, the man remained calm. He knew that when the time came, the lake would tell the story more clearly than any words or threats ever could. The boat stayed where it had always been, gently rocking in the water. A silent reminder of years of patience and quiet strength. Life continued in the small lakeside community. Some watched with curiosity, some with fear, some with hope, but the man never wavered. He understood the balance between confrontation and patience, between power and understanding. The neighbors were learning the hard way, and he was ready to let them discover the truth on their own. Little did they know, the moment when their assumptions would be shattered was approaching faster than they expected. The situation grew more tense with each passing week. The neighbors' demands did not lessen. In fact, they became bolder. Now, they were no longer satisfied with notes or verbal warnings. They had started involving local officials, claiming the boat violated rules and that something had to be done immediately. The man, however, remained calm. He had seen this kind of overconfidence before. People who believed they held power often acted louder than necessary, hoping that noise alone would intimidate those who were quiet and steady. One morning, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find two people he had never met before. They introduced themselves politely as representatives from the city and the local property association. They explained that they had received complaints about the boat and had been asked to investigate. They carried folders, clipboards, and a polite but firm air of authority. "Can you tell us about this boat?" one of them asked. The man invited them in, offered tea, and explained simply, "I have kept this boat here for many years. I fish. I enjoy the water. There has never been a complaint until recently." The representatives nodded and asked to see any documents regarding the lake. The man calmly provided copies of old land deeds, historical maps, and property records, everything organized neatly. He had anticipated this moment long before the neighbors began their campaign. As they reviewed the documents, the representatives' expressions shifted. At first, they were polite and neutral, following procedure. But as the hours passed, questions arose, papers were compared, and notes were taken. The man did not interfere. He allowed them to work, knowing that facts carried more weight than arguments. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued their attempts to assert authority. They arrived at the lake speaking loudly about rules and regulations, hoping that witnesses would see them as right. Some community members watched from a distance, curious and unsure. They had never seen the man behave aggressively or cause problems. Many remembered seeing him fishing quietly in the early mornings, tending to the boat, walking along the shore without disturbing anyone. The investigation required more than just documents. The representatives wanted maps, historical usage records, and even old photographs. The man provided everything he could find, staying patient. He answered every question calmly, without emotion, without frustration. In contrast, the neighbors grew impatient. They were used to people being intimidated by volume and threats. But here, facts were being checked, records were being reviewed, and the man's quiet confidence made them uneasy. Days turned into a week, and the investigation deepened. Officials came back multiple times, walking the shoreline, measuring distances, verifying claims, and speaking with other residents. The neighbors became anxious, realizing that their certainty might be misplaced. They whispered among themselves, planning, trying to come up with new arguments. But the foundations of their claims were shaky. The man, on his part, continued his routine. Early mornings on the lake, simple meals, quiet evenings on the porch. Sometimes he would watch the officials work, noting their questions, their reactions, and the way the neighbors fumbled for answers. He did not gloat or taunt. He merely observed, knowing that patience would soon reveal the truth. One afternoon, one of the representatives called him aside. "There is something unusual here," they said quietly. "The documents you provided show ownership and usage rights far beyond what we initially understood. This lake has been part of your family records for generations. Can you explain?" The man smiled faintly. "The lake has always been part of the property. It has been my responsibility, not just a place for recreation." The representative nodded slowly, carefully taking notes. "This changes the situation," they said. Back on the shore, the neighbors were growing more desperate. They had assumed control, assumed authority, and now those assumptions were crumbling. They tried again, speaking loudly, waving documents, showing photos, trying to convince officials of their claims. But the officials were thorough. They listened, they compared, they measured, and they checked every historical record. Each time the neighbors' arguments weakened, community members began to notice. Some spoke quietly among themselves. "It looks like we were wrong," one said. "He's been here longer than anyone. He has documents to prove it," as another replied. "We should have seen this from the start." It's not about who shouts the loudest. The man did not seek praise. He stayed silent when others spoke about him. He knew that the goal was not recognition, it was justice and clarity. By the end of the week, officials began to gather all their findings. Maps, deeds, historical usage records, photographs, and witness statements were compiled. The man had provided everything neatly, calmly, and completely. The neighbors were no longer confident. They looked worried and frustrated. Some began to speak less. Realizing that their assumptions about authority were no longer valid, the man continued his quiet routine on the lake. The water reflected the sun, the trees, and the sky, as it always had. The official shredded several times to clarify details, asking questions about past usage, historical events, and ownership transfers. The man answered each question patiently. The neighbors hovered nearby, increasingly uneasy watching everything unfold, realizing that their loud voices and aggressive actions might have been misguided. The situation reached a turning point when the lead representative gathered everyone for a preliminary meeting. "We have reviewed the documents and historical records," the representative began. "There are significant findings that must be addressed before any decision is made. The current situation is more complicated than it seemed initially." The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered to one another. Their certainty, once unshakable, was replaced with doubt. The man listened quietly, not interrupting. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the tension around him. After the meeting, the neighbors confronted him again privately. "This can't be true," one said. "We've been told the lake is under community jurisdiction. How can you have all these rights?" The man looked at them steadily. "I have always had these rights. Facts do not change because they are inconvenient. Yes. You can't just, the neighbor began, frustrated. "You assumed control without knowing the history," the man said simply. "That was your mistake." The neighbors left, muttering, defeated and uncertain. The officials continued their work for several more days, verifying details, consulting additional records, and confirming ownership. Each day the man maintained his routine, quietly checking the boat, observing the water, and remaining composed. Other residents began to see the situation differently. They watched the man not with suspicion or curiosity, but with respect. They realized that patience, preparation, and knowledge were far more powerful than shouting, threats, or false confidence. One afternoon, the lead representative approached the man privately. "We have completed the initial investigation," they said. "Your ownership and usage rights are clear. The neighbors' complaints do not hold legally." The man nodded, his face calm. "Thank you. That is all I needed to know." Representative smiled slightly. "It's unusual to see someone handle this with such composure. Most people would have reacted emotionally, causing delays and conflicts." "I prefer facts to emotion," the man replied. "The lake does not belong to anyone in particular except as the law and history define it." Meanwhile, the neighbors were left to reconsider their position. Their confidence had been shaken, and they had begun to understand that assumptions about power and authority could be dangerous. Some residents spoke privately with them, gently reminding them of the importance of respect, history, and verification. Over the next few days, the man continued to use the lake as he always had. Early mornings, quiet fishing, evenings on the porch. The water remained calm, and his boat remained where it had always been. The neighbors had begun to retreat, realizing that persistence alone would not overturn facts. The man reflected quietly on the events that had transpired. He thought about patience, about observing without reacting unnecessarily, and about letting truth emerge on its own timeline. The lake had not changed. Only the understanding of it had. The neighbors, for their part, were still uneasy. They had learned that confidence without knowledge could be dangerous. They had tried to impose rules that did not apply, threatened actions that were baseless, and assumed authority that was not theirs to claim. Each document, each record, each official inquiry had revealed the reality they had ignored. The man remained composed, patient, and steady. He knew that the final chapter of this confrontation was approaching, and when it arrived, the lessons would be clear. Respect, patience, and knowledge were far stronger than noise, threats, or assumptions. The lake reflected the sky, the trees, and the fading sunlight. The boat rocked gently in the water, untouched, steady, a symbol of years of patience and quiet confidence. And beneath the calm, the truth was ready to be revealed to everyone who had doubted it. The morning began like any other. The sun rose gently over the lake, painting the water with streaks of gold and orange. Birds sang softly, and a light breeze moved through the trees. Yet, beneath this calm, the atmosphere around the lake was tense. The neighbors had gathered again, this time looking restless and uncertain. They whispered to one another, glancing nervously toward the man's boat, which floated quietly as it always had. The officials had returned. This time they came not to investigate, but to deliver findings. The lead representative walked calmly toward the man, carrying a folder thick with papers. His face was serious, but respectful. "We have reviewed everything," the representative said. "Maps, historical records, photographs, property deeds, and legal documents. Everything confirms what you've said. The lake, the shoreline where your boat is moored, and the rights to use it belong to you." The man listened quietly, nodding once. He did not smile, did not gloat. He simply acknowledged the truth, letting the calmness of his demeanor speak louder than words. From the edges of the group, the neighbors whispered to one another. Their confident expressions had vanished, replaced with disbelief and unease. The reality was sinking in slowly. They had been challenging someone who held all the legal and historical authority they had assumed was theirs. The lead representative continued. "Any complaints about your boat, any claims made by the neighbors regarding regulations or fines, have no legal basis. We advise that all parties respect this conclusion and avoid further conflict." One of the neighbors stepped forward, clearly struggling to hide embarrassment. We didn't know," they stammered. "We thought the lake. We assumed—" "You assumed wrongly," the man said quietly. His tone was even calm and composed, but each word carried weight. He did not shout or scold. He simply stated the truth. Another neighbor muttered under their breath. But the words were half-hearted, as if even they knew the point was settled. The other residents who had been watching exchanged glances, some nodding silently in acknowledgement. The man had handled everything with dignity, patience, and clarity. No one could deny that now. The neighbor's body language told the story more clearly than their words. Shoulders slumped, heads bowed, eyes avoiding contact. They had attempted to assert control, tried to impose rules, and even involved authorities. But their assumptions had been shattered. They had not considered the history, the documents, or the quiet strength of the man they had challenged. From now on, the lead representative said, turning to the neighbors, all disputes about the lake or usage rights should respect the legal ownership. Any further complaints without basis may be considered harassment. The neighbors muttered quietly among themselves, clearly debating whether to apologize or retreat. Some seemed defensive, as if admitting the truth felt like losing face. Others, however, looked genuinely ashamed. Realizing how quickly they had judged without knowing the facts, the man stepped closer to his boat. Touching the weathered wood, feeling its familiar smoothness under his hands, this was his space, his time, his history. He had not fought aggressively. He had not raised his voice or threatened anyone. He had simply waited for the truth to emerge. Knowing that patience and preparation would win over noise and assumptions, one of the neighbors finally spoke. Hesitantly, We didn't understand. We assumed, we thought we had the right. Assumptions are dangerous," the man replied. His voice was soft, steady, and calm. "Respect is stronger than assumptions." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Some neighbors looked embarrassed, others thoughtful. Even the officials nodded slightly, recognizing the wisdom in his calm approach. Over the next few days, the neighbors began to change. Their visits to the shore became less frequent. Their notes stopped appearing. They avoided confrontations, speaking quietly if they had to. Some even apologized to nearby residents for the disturbance. Admitting they had acted hastily and without full knowledge, the man continued his routine, quietly observing the lake, checking the boat, and enjoying the calm mornings. He noticed small shifts in the community. People who had been hesitant to speak were now more relaxed. The tension that had hung over the lake like a storm cloud was lifting, placed by quiet respect. At one point, a neighbor approached him cautiously. "I'm sorry for the trouble," they said. "We should have asked before assuming anything. We were wrong." The man nodded, his expression calm. "Thank you. That is all I ask." Even the officials who had come to deliver the findings seemed impressed. They had expected a heated confrontation, perhaps arguments or frustration. Instead, they saw patience, preparation, and quiet strength. They understood that the man had not only proven his rights, but had done so with dignity. The community began to settle into a new rhythm. The lake returned to its natural calm. The boat floated steadily on the water, a silent reminder of history, patience, and quiet authority. Neighbors who had once been loud and aggressive now spoke with more humility. They no longer assumed control over what they did not understand. The man reflected on the weeks that had passed. He thought about human nature, about how easily people can judge based on assumptions, how quickly they can claim authority without knowing the facts. He smiled faintly, realizing that this had been a lesson not just for the neighbors, but for everyone who had watched the events unfold. Even as peace returned, he remained vigilant. The lake had been calm for generations, and he had no intention of letting it be disturbed again. But he also knew that calm waters could reflect strength, more powerfully than waves ever could. Children played quietly on the shore. Elders walked along the paths, and the occasional fisherman drifted across the water. The neighbors had learned humility, the community had learned patience, and the man had reminded everyone that truth, preparation, and quiet confidence were stronger than noise and assumptions. The boat stayed where it had always been. The man's presence on the lake remained steady, a symbol of calm authority. And beneath the surface of the water, the lessons of the weeks that had passed settled quietly, ready to guide anyone who witnessed them in the evenings. The sun would set, casting gold and orange reflections across the water. The man would sit on the dock, looking out over the lake, listening to the soft hum of life around him. He did not need to celebrate or boast. The peace itself was the reward. The neighbors, meanwhile, were learning slowly. They no longer challenged him openly. They spoke more carefully, measured their words, and considered the consequences before acting. The lessons of humility and respect had been learned the hard way. They had been learned. The lake, timeless and calm, continued to reflect the sky and trees, as it always had. The boat remained steady, a quiet testament to years of patience, dignity, and quiet strength. And the man who had faced noise, threats, and assumptions remained composed, knowing that true authority was not in shouting or demanding, but in knowing the facts, respecting history, and waiting for the right moment. Life around the lake returned to its peaceful rhythm. The tension that had once dominated the mornings and evenings dissipated. Conversations were calm. Birds sang as they had for years. Water rippled gently along the shore, reflecting the sunlight. And in the midst of it all, the man's boat floated as it always had, and challenged, steady. And rightfully his, the neighbors would remember the lesson for a long time. Assumptions can be misleading. Loud voices cannot replace facts, and respect is earned, not demanded. The man, meanwhile, continued his quiet life, showing that dignity and patience could overcome conflict more effectively than anger or force ever could. The lake, the boat, and the man became symbols not of confrontation, but of quiet truth, patience, and the power of calm authority. And everyone who witnessed the events knew, without needing to say it aloud, that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks least, but carries the weight of facts, history, and integrity. the lake was calm again, almost as if the weeks of tension had never happened. The morning mist rose slowly from the water, curling in delicate threads that danced over the surface. Birds sang quietly among the trees, and the occasional fish broke the water with soft splashes. The man stood on the dock, looking out over the lake, feeling the gentle movement of the boat beneath his hands. It had been a long journey to this point, one filled with challenges, impatience, and assumptions. But finally, there was peace. The neighbors, once loud and demanding, had retreated. Their aggressive notes and frequent confrontations had ceased, replaced with quiet acknowledgement of the truth. Some of them came to speak with him personally, approaching cautiously, aware of the history they had almost ignored. "I wanted to apologize," one neighbor said, hesitating at the edge of the dock. "We acted without understanding. We assumed the lake was under our control." The man looked at them steadily, without anger or pride. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "That is all anyone needs to do, acknowledge when they are wrong." Other neighbors followed, each offering similar words. Some were hesitant, others more confident, but all shared the same realization. Assumptions could be dangerous, and respect mattered more than noise or confidence. Even the officials who had come weeks earlier returned occasionally. Not to mediate, but simply to observe. They were impressed by how the man had handled everything. He had never raised his voice. He had never reacted emotionally. He had simply remained calm, prepared, and patient, allowing facts to carry the weight of truth. Life around the lake began to return to a gentle rhythm. Children played along the shore, their laughter mingling with the soft rush of the water. Elderly residents walked along the paths, greeting one another with smiles and nods. Small boats floated on the lake, gently rocking in the currents, and the man's boat, steady and unchanged, remained at its usual spot. It's a symbol of quiet resilience and dignity. The man reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about human nature, how quickly people jump to conclusions, how often assumptions replace understanding, and how easy it is for conflict to grow when knowledge is incomplete. He smiled faintly, knowing that the tension had taught everyone a valuable lesson, even the neighbors who had challenged him. He also thought about patience. So often people believe that action must be immediate, that problems must be solved quickly, and that force is the only way to gain respect. Yet, in this situation, patience had been far more powerful than force or anger. By waiting, preparing, and remaining calm, he had allowed the truth to emerge naturally. The neighbors had begun to notice this as well. They no longer approached him with demands. When they spoke, their voices were quieter, careful. Some of them even sought his guidance on matters they had previously thought they controlled. He answered politely, sharing knowledge when appropriate. It's never asserting dominance, only offering clarity. Even the community as a whole had shifted. People who had watched the conflict from the sidelines began to respect the importance of listening, observing, and seeking understanding before acting. They had seen how assumptions could mislead, how loud voices could intimidate, and how patience could resolve tension without conflict. One afternoon, a group of neighbors approached him together. They stood at the edge of the dock, their expressions a mixture of humility and curiosity. "We wanted to ask, how did you stay so calm?" One of them asked. "We were certain we were right, and yet you never raised your voice, never threatened, and never lost control." The man smiled softly. "Calm comes from knowing the facts and trusting in them. You cannot argue with truth, and you cannot rush history. Patience allows the truth to speak for itself." The neighbors nodded slowly, realizing the depth of what he was saying. They had learned more than legal ownership or lake boundaries. They had learned about dignity, patience, and quiet strength. Even the smallest interactions around the lake reflected this change. Neighbors who once argued over trivial matters now spoke politely. Children learned to share space on the shore. Elderly residents commented on how the community felt lighter, calmer, more respectful. The man observed all of this quietly, knowing that his approach had influenced more than just the immediate conflict. Days passed, and the lake remained peaceful. The boat floated steadily, rocking gently with the currents. Sunsets painted the water with shades of gold and pink, reflecting across the trees. The man would often sit on the dock, sipping tea, watching the natural rhythm of the lake, feeling a quiet satisfaction that came from seeing balance restored. The neighbors, too, continued to learn. They would sometimes consult him for advice, not because he demanded it, but because they had come to respect his knowledge and experience. Each interaction reinforced the lesson they had learned. Respect is earned, not forced. Patience is stronger than shouting, and assumptions can lead to unnecessary conflict, even long after the tension had passed. The lake remained a symbol of these lessons. Visitors would sometimes ask about the history of the man and his boat. Residents would quietly explain how patience, preparation, and calm strength had preserved peace, and how one person's dignity could influence an entire community. The man did not seek recognition. He did not boast or claim victory. For him, the lake, the boat, and the quiet mornings were enough. He had protected what mattered most with respect, integrity, and patience, and that was reward enough. One morning, he noticed a young family near the shore, children laughing as they dipped their toes into the water. He smiled, remembering how the lake had been his sanctuary for years, and now it was a place where others could enjoy its calm without fear or conflict. The boat floated nearby, unchanged, steadfast, a reminder of what had endured. Even the neighbors who had once challenged him now walked along the paths politely, nodding in acknowledgement. They had learned humility, and their behavior reflected it. Some spoke quietly to other residents about the importance of understanding before acting, sharing the story of what had happened in hopes that future conflicts could be avoided. The man continued to live quietly by the lake. He fished in the mornings, read in the afternoons, and watched the sunset in the evenings. The boat remained at its usual spot, steady and secure, a silent witness to history and a symbol of patience and calm strength. And through it all, the community thrived. People respected one another more, listened more carefully, and considered the consequences of their actions. The lessons of the weeks of tension were now part of daily life: patience, dignity, understanding, and respect for history.